There are some top-notch left-handed starters available in free agency this offseason. And reportedly, the Orioles are going to be players at the top of that market. So let's look at which of those lefty starters would fit best in Baltimore. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, November 22nd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are continuing our Free Agent Friday series as we do another free agent wish list. This one is for left-handed starting pitchers who are on the free agent market this offseason. I'll give you my top 6 free agent lefties who I think the Orioles should pursue in free agency. We'll talk about some interesting under-the-radar names like maybe a Matthew Boyd and some guys at the top of the market like Max Fried and Blake Snell. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we'll jump right into this wish list. Again, we've been doing this for pretty much every position that the Orioles may be looking at adding to in free agency this offseason. We talked about some of the backup catchers. We've talked about right-handed hitting outfielders. And today we move on to left-handed starting pitchers. Now, the O's absolutely will be adding one starting pitcher, and I would love for them to add 2, to be quite frank, this offseason. And I really do hope, just with the way the Orioles rotation is constructed, that one of them is a lefty. Because if the Orioles say even just add one pitcher this offseason and it's a righty, there's a good chance they go into next year and their starting 5 is all right-handers. Like, you could go in with, say they add a righty in free agency, whomever that is, Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Dean Kramer, Albert Suarez. Is that 5 out of the question? Absolutely not. I mean, your lefties right now, Cade Povich certainly could have a spot for him somewhere. Trevor Rogers, hopefully a bounce back, could have a spot somewhere, but there's not a lefty where you're like, yeah, he's going to be in the Orioles rotation next year. And even with the wall moved in now at Camden Yards, the ballpark still plays better to left-handed pitchers. And I just think a lefty would fit nicely in this rotation. So let's talk about some of the best lefties that are out there in free agency. I'll go from number 6 to number 1. This isn't necessarily a just power ranking for me from 6 to 1 free agent lefties. It is my personal wish list. Number 1 being I would most like the Orioles to go after this guy. Number 6 being still a guy I'd like the O's to go after, but it'll go in that order. And we begin with number 6. That is 33-year-old left-hander Matthew Boyd, who will turn 34 in February. So next year will be his age 34 season, who spent, well, at least part of the 2024 season with the Cleveland Guardians. The free agent matrix put together by John Becker of FanGraphs, which basically combines every single free agent contract projection that is out there and averages them out to one number that you can kind of talk about, predicts a 1-year, $14 million contract is what Matthew Boyd would get this offseason. So first and foremost, cheap, very low risk, 1-year deal it would seemingly take for Boyd. And it makes sense because Matthew Boyd did not pitch a lot last year, including the postseason. Boyd made a total of 11 starts in the major leagues in 2024 because he was returning from injury. Boyd had Tommy John surgery in June of 2023 when he was back with the Detroit Tigers and was not having a great year. 15 starts, had a 5.45 ERA, wasn't pitching super well, and the Tommy John may have had something to do with that. Now, his recovery was actually, I'm not going to say super fast, but it was on the quicker side of the timeline, and he really started ramping up the throwing, about 11 or so months later, about a year later, into June of 2024. And he started throwing as showcases for teams because Boyd, because he was so early in the Tommy John process, he was 33. He, didn't have the best track record lately with the injuries and the performance. He didn't get a contract with anyone last offseason. So he was still a free agent heading into the summer. He was throwing for teams. And the Guardians ended up taking a chance on him. They signed him on June 29th to kind of a one-year prorated contract. And he went to the minors to rehab, and it took him about a month and a half. And then on August 13th, the Guardians activated him to the big league roster to return, right around 14 months after Tommy John surgery. And he pitched well down the stretch. He did not allow more than 3 runs in any of his 11 starts. He made 8 starts in the regular season, 39 and 2/3 innings, a 2.72 ERA for Boyd in that time, with a 28% strikeout rate and an 8% walk rate. All fantastic numbers for Boyd in those 8 starts. And then in the 3 in the postseason, he wasn't as dominant, but he was good in those 3 starts as well. He only allowed 1 earned run in 11 and 2/3 innings with the Guardians in the postseason as they made their run to the ALCS. And I mentioned he didn't give up more than 3 earned runs in any of those 11 starts. Well, really, there was only 1 start where he allowed 3. In 10 of the 11 starts he made this year, 2 earned runs or less allowed by Matthew Boyd. Now, again, this is an extremely small sample size, but it's a veteran pitcher who came back from Tommy John, was pitching in some of the biggest moments. I mean, he pitched some of the biggest postseason games this year for Cleveland and pitched well pretty much every time he went out there. His command was good. His fastball velocity was normal. He's generally a guy who throws about 92 miles an hour from the left side, and that's what he was back to coming off of Tommy John. So those were all great things. Four-seamer, changeup, slider, sinker, curveball guy is what we saw per usual from Matthew Boyd when he came back. Didn't make any gigantic tweaks to his pitch mix or anything like that. Now, Stuff Plus doesn't love Matthew Boyd. He was at about a 75. That's pure stuff. But, a lefty at 33 coming off Tommy John who's throwing 92, that's not going to be a stuff monster. But he has a good, interesting, deceptive arm angle. He kind of hides the ball pretty well. And his off-speed stuff plays. His changeup had a 35% whiff rate used against righties. His slider, 45% swing and miss. The curveball, 47% swing and miss. I mean, opponents hit just 148 against the slider and hit just 150 against his 92-mile-per-hour four-seam fastball. His stuff plays really well because of the arm slot, because of the delivery, and because he commands it well. And it's just deception that really works out for him. Now, the reason why he's this low, you're saying, Connor, I'm hearing a lot of good things. Had a good year. Numbers were good. Well, it was also 11 starts. And that's because he was coming off Tommy John. He's going to be 34. And he's had injury issues in the past. He had a flexor tendon surgery back in 2021. He hasn't thrown 100 innings in a season since 2019. No. I'm not saying hasn't thrown 200 innings. He has not thrown 100 innings in a season since 2019. So if you're signing Matthew Boyd, even if it is to a one-year deal, knowing there's risk there, I don't know if you can count on more than 20 starts maximum that you would get out of him. And that's certainly helpful, but there's just a lot of injury questions. Durability issues, you worry there's maybe another injury looming. Maybe a perfect bill of health Matthew Boyd is higher on this list, but you can't even count on him for one full season, even if it is a one-year deal. And because the Orioles should be playing at the top of the market, that's why he's down here at 6. But the performance was still good enough where it's if he's the second edition, right? If there's a top level edition and then Boyd comes in to be the 4 or 5 starter, I'm fine with that. But this can't be the guy you're bringing in this offseason, but still would be certainly a good addition. Number 5 on my list is another 33-year-old lefty named Andrew Heaney, who spent his 2024 season with the Texas Rangers. John Becker's free agency matrix predicts a 2-year, $24 million contract for Heaney in free agency this offseason. It's been kind of an interesting ride for Andrew Heaney, but he's kind of become somewhat durable again. Now, through last season for the Rangers, it's not like he was throwing 200 innings, but he threw 160 innings. 31 starts, had a 4.28 ERA with a 23% K rate and a 6% walk rate on the season. It was just the second time in his career he had thrown 160 innings or more. He threw 180 all the way back in 2018 with the Angels, but it was kind of interesting to watch because his ERA rose as his innings count rose, and he kind of turned himself into, I'm not going to call Andrew Heaney an innings eater. He's much closer to a 5 and dive guy where he throws for 5 innings, throws 90 plus pitches and comes out of the game, but he's not the high, crazy strikeout guy he was at one point in his career. Quite frankly, his production is much closer to league average at this point. He had the lowest walk rate of his career at 6%, but that was coupled with the lowest strikeout rate of his career at 23%. So he just kind of was becoming a different pitcher, but that didn't mean he could pitch deeper into games. Still only 8 of his 31 starts did he go 6 innings or more. He was basically averaging 5 innings every time he went out there. And that was kind of the Andrew Heaney, when he had that dominant year with the Dodgers back in 2024 that was shortened by injury, but when he had a 3.10 ERA and he had as a starter, a 36% strikeout rate to a 6% walk rate was absurd what he did that year with the Dodgers. And then he signed with the Angels and he really wasn't able to, signed with Texas and just really wasn't able to repeat it. He was good the last 2 years. He certainly helped the Rangers. He pitched in the playoffs, helped them to that World Series in 2023, but just couldn't become the same pitcher he was in LA. The reason why I'm interested in him is that I think that pitcher with the Dodgers is still in there. Again, it was 73 innings before he got injured that year with LA when he was dominant, but that stuff is still in there. Now, it's kind of an interesting mix despite the high K rates. Like, he only throws 92 with the four-seamer, but the slider can be ridiculous and the changeup can be ridiculous. And he's got a curveball and a sinker and a cutter that he'll toss in from time to time. But it's really that fastball slider changeup combination that allows him to get lefties and righties out. And he still had a chase rate at 31% this year. That's really, really good, getting guys to swing at pitches outside of the zone. His combo of pitches allows him to attack righties really well. And he also started to mix in a sinker late in the year. For the first time in his career, was a pitch that actually helped him get lefties out at a better rate. Ended up being better against righties than lefties this year, but the sinker helped him against left-handers late in the year. And honestly, again, 160 innings, a 4 ERA, like that's, I think, what you can expect from Andrew Heaney at this point in his career. And is the ceiling there? Maybe you would argue no, but my argument for Andrew Heaney is, look, like, he bookended his season with terrible months this year. He had a 6.26 ERA in April and a 5.96 ERA in September for the Rangers. He was awesome in those middle 4 months for Texas this year. And I just feel like he's gotten to the point, as long as he can stay healthy, and he stayed healthy the last couple of years, if he can stay healthy, his floor is much closer to what he did this year. He stays healthy most of the year. He makes 30 starts. He throws 160 innings. He gives you an ERA in the low 4s, and he is an above average to above average productive major league number 4 or 5 starter. And that's a nice guy to have, especially if you're slotting him in lower in your rotation. But the reason why I like him is because I still think he has a ceiling, maybe even a ceiling that a guy like Matthew Boyd doesn't have at this point, even though Boyd had better numbers last year, but a ceiling of what he did just 2 years ago with the Dodgers, and that Dodgers pitching development factory that the Orioles seem to be creeping closer and closer to having. Maybe him in Baltimore can unlock what he did 2 years ago. He threw more breaking balls. He had new shapes on those pitches, just got a ton of whiffs with LA that year. And then he had the shoulder issues that shut him down for the rest of the season. But I feel like he's a guy who might have a high floor and then also a high ceiling. And it's hard to get those guys because sometimes the guys with the high ceilings could have a pretty low floor. He seems like to be a safe bet. And then if you can unlock whatever he did 2 years ago, he can evolve from 4 or 5 starter to number 2 starter if he just throws what he did for the Dodgers. And that is what really intrigues me. Again, not good enough to make him the best starting pitching acquisition of the offseason, but if he's your second acquisition, I'm kind of loving that because it feels like low-ish risk with a very high reward if they could figure out what Heaney did with the Dodgers back in 2022. But those two guys, Heaney and Boyd, are the two guys where it's like would absolutely help the Orioles, but I do not want either of them to be the best starting pitcher the O's acquire this offseason. The top 4 on my list, I might be okay if any of these 4 guys are the O's best starting pitcher signing this winter. And we'll get to number 4 and 3 on that list coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time now has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, it'll be a while before we're buying baseball tickets on Game Time again, but in the offseason, maybe you want to go see basketball, hockey, football. Do it all at Game Time. They got the best deals, amazing views from your seat. You can toggle a feature so that it's the all-in pricing, right? You can see those prices before checkout without any of those surprise fees. But hey, if you're just a baseball fan and the offseason is the offseason, you want to see a concert, you want to see some theater, you want to see some comedy, you can do it all with Game Time Picks. That curation makes it easier to save on all of those tickets. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So as we move on my Orioles left-handed starting pitcher wish list among the free agents this offseason, we move to number 4 on my list. And number 4 comes in as Sean Manaea. Sean Manaea, a 32-year-old left-hander who will be 33 in February, so next year will be his age 33 season, spent 2024 with the Mets, and the free agent matrix from John Becker predicts him to get a 3-year, $68 million contract this offseason, which is pretty much right around $23 million per year on that average annual value. Now, Sean Manaea has had a solid career so far, right? He came up in 2016 with the A's. He threw a no-hitter in Oakland. He was there until 2021. He had his ups, he had his downs, he had his injuries, but he was a really solid starter there with the A's. Then he signed with San Diego in 2022, and he wasn't great. And then he signed with the Giants in 23, and he was a little bit better, but he still wasn't amazing. And they were kind of using him weird, where he made 10 starts, but he would pitch in bulk, and he threw 118 innings, and he had like no defined role with the Giants in 2023. So the Mets took a chance on him in 2024, and he was pretty good throughout the first half of the season. Don't get me wrong. He was a solid part of that Mets rotation. And then the lefty Manaea was watching Chris Sale throw. Sale, who was on his way to winning the Cy Young Award in the National League with the Braves this year, and the kind of the sidearm delivery from the lefty Chris Sale, a guy who has dominated the Orioles over the years, as we know, in his time with the White Sox and the Red Sox. And Manaea just basically said, you know what? I want to throw like that. So later in the year, around July, he kind of started to lower his arm angle to fit it more like Chris Sale. And he really made most of the change in August, and then it truly, truly clicked in September. He was getting better in August, but it really clicked in September and in parts of the postseason as well. The Stuff Plus rating, which is just a number that's basically pure nastiness of your pitches, where around 100 is closer to league average, sometimes in the 90s. His sinker Stuff Plus went from 82 to 107 when he made that arm slot change, and he was just throwing a lot more sinkers. And he just threw them and threw them and threw them. And only 4 sinkers in baseball were better via StatCast this year. Only 2 sinkers had a better Stuff Plus this year. One was via Chris Sale. That is among starting pitchers in the majors. And his 4-seam fastball from Manaea was pretty good as well. But he didn't totally ditch it, but he threw it less because the sinker from the sidearm slot was so unhittable. He was just like, this is my fastball now. And he would still throw his 4-seamer from time to time. It didn't have as much kind of ride and movement on it as it had with his old arm angle. But in September, he threw this 4-seamer way less. He kind of went sinker, sweeper, changeup that allowed him to get righties and lefties out. And he just kind of dominated there for a while. In the latter months of the year, the ERAs were around 3, and he ended up ending the season with 32 starts, 181 and 2/3 innings, a 3.47 ERA with a 25% K rate and 8% walk rate. And he just pitched really well for the Mets. It was one of their best starters in the postseason. And again, his numbers didn't really jump off the page. Like his ERA in the first half, I believe it dropped just barely in the second half, despite making that arm slot change that kind of turned his season around. But all the data, all the underlying numbers, all the projection moving forward got so much better with that new arm angle. And really the tough part was he was better against righties with the old approach. The new arm angle made it basically impossible for lefties to hit him, especially with that sinker. And so the questions now for Manaea, as he's being, maybe a 3-year, $70-ish million deal, which isn't the most expensive deal out there, but that's a commitment to a starting pitcher, a guy who's going to be 33. Can he keep it up? That's the big question for Manaea. That's the only reason why he is as low as he is at number 4 on my list. I am in love with what he did with changing the arm angle and how good he was in the second half for the Mets. But the question is, A, do you want to give up a draft pick because he does have the qualifying offer attached to him? And B, can he keep this arm angle? Like, is what he did for 2 months real? Or is he going to have to go back to the old arm angle? Or is he going to realize, hey, my other stuff isn't playing well enough. I can't just rely on my sinker and change up from this arm angle. I got to go back. And if he goes back, he's still a productive, solid starter that you absolutely want in your major league rotation. But he's not the player, the pitcher that had ace upside in the second half, not the player that has Chris Sale upside when he made that change to mimic Chris Sale in the second half. So I think he could be worth this price at 3 years, $68 million. I think he could have a huge back end of his career with this change. But the reason he's down at number 4 is because we've only seen it for a couple of months, and all of it looked great from Sean Manaea, but it could just go away just like that. We just don't know. I'd like to see a full season of the more sidearm angle to know that he is legit. And that's why he's only at number 4. But I can tell you right now, I am salivating at what the stuff looks like from this angle. He gets incredible extension down the mound. You combine that with the sidearm angle, it's impossible for lefties to hit him. He's got the stuff to make it tough for righties. I just worry that you pay him that much money and he turns into an average starter, which is still okay. It still helps your team. But you would like for him to be the pitcher he was down the stretch with the Mets. Number 3 on my list is a guy who also broke out in the second half this year, and that is 33-year-old left-hander Yusei Kikuchi, who started 2024 with the Blue Jays. The O's know him well. He's been with Toronto since 2022, but the Jays, with him being an impending free agent and the Jays completely out of it, they traded him to the Astros at the deadline for a fairly large prospect haul, much larger than any other team, including the Orioles, that were in on Kikuchi, were willing to give up to Toronto in that deal. But it turned out still to be a good deal for the Astros. Now, John Becker's free agent matrix has a 3-year, $50 million prediction on Kikuchi, so same length, but a little bit cheaper than Sean Manaea would be for a pitcher who is essentially the same age. But when he was traded to Houston, the strikeouts went up, the walks went down, he cut his ERA by about 2 runs. Here were his stats in Houston. 22 starts, 115 innings, 4.75 ERA, 26% strikeout rate, 6% walk rate. Goes to Houston, 10 starts, 60 innings, 2.7 ERA, strikeout rate up to 32%, and the walk rate actually ticked down a couple of percentage points. Opponents hit 269 against him in Toronto. They hit 187 against him in Houston. And I get it, right? It's a much smaller sample size. It's about half the innings he threw in Houston that he did in Toronto. But there were actual tangible changes that the Astros made. They had him throw his slider a whole lot more. It was always his trustworthy number 2 pitch that he would go for to get a strikeout a lot of times. But in September, for the first time in his career, he threw his slider 39% of the time. It became his number 1 most used pitch. I believe that was the first month of his career where his slider was his most used pitch. I was kind of looking back. It's been some years. He's spent a good amount of time in Seattle as well after coming over to Major League Baseball. But I don't think there was a month in his career where he threw his slider more than any other pitch until September of this year, and opponents hit 209 against that slider. He also started throwing the slider harder, which was kind of intriguing to look at. His slider was more 88 miles per hour with Houston and up to 89 at times, where it was a little bit more 86, 87 at times with the Blue Jays. So that was a little bit interesting to see how he threw it. He knocked down his curveball usage by a lot. He was still a 4-pitch guy, 4-seamer, slider, curveball, and changeup, but he kind of knocked down the changeup rate a little bit, knocked down the curveball rate a lot, and just said, hey, I've got a great 4-seam fastball. I've got a great slider. I'm going to throw them both a lot. It was, almost 40% of each of them, and didn't become fully a 2-pitch pitcher, but was kind of close to that. And it didn't matter. He was great. He looked like something close to a number 1. I mean, he was clearly a good number 2 starter in baseball in those 10 starts, and looked like he could be close to an ace. That's how well he was pitching. Now, obviously, he is aging, but he's shown good durability throughout his career. Like, pretty much every year that he's been able to stay healthy, he's throwing 160 plus innings, threw only 100 in 2022, had a little bit of an injury that year, also had some ineffectiveness, got moved to the bullpen. But the last 2 years, 32 starts, each of the last 2 seasons, 167, and then 176 innings overall. That's a guy who's going to go out there and pitch for you every 5th day, give you a strong 6 innings, and give you a chance to win. Now, he's had a bit of a home run problem in his career, but even with the fences moving back in a little bit in left field, maybe Oriole Park for a lefty can help him out with that a bit. But at this price, I mean, cheaper than Manaea, that's not a lot of money, 3 years, $50 million to get a guy who could be your number 2 starter. I mean, he was 10th in stuff plus among all starting pitchers this season. And his 4-seamer was 5th. I mean, it's an elite 4-seamer slider combination. He could be really, really good for this Orioles team. And again, 3 years, $50 million, especially with David Rubenstein around for starting pitching, that is not very expensive at all to get a starter for essentially what equates to $16 to $17 million per year for a guy that's been as good and as durable as Yusei Kikuchi has been. I would be all over that if I'm the Orioles. And again, if he ends up being your number 1 starting pitching acquisition, it's not the most exciting, but I think it'd be a really good number 2 to put in there with Grayson Rodriguez and with Zach Eflin. But even if Kikuchi pitched like it down the stretch, he's not an ace at this point in the majors. He's a good number 2 starter. He's not an ace. The final 2 guys on my list are aces, and these are not pipe dreams anymore. The Orioles are showing serious interest in being big spenders and signing one of these 2 aces we're going to talk about coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So now we get to the top 2 guys on my list, on my Orioles free agent left-handed starting pitcher wish list. And number 2 on the list, it is Max Fried. Now, there's already been reported interest by the Orioles in Max Fried this offseason, and for good reason. Max Fried, 30-year-old lefty, he'll be 31 in January, has spent his entire career with the Atlanta Braves, at least in the majors. Was a first-round pick out of high school by the Padres back in 2012, was traded to the Braves, debuted with them in 2017, and has been with Atlanta ever since, and he has been awesome ever since. I really think since 2020, when he posted a 2.25 ERA in the 11 starts in the shortened season, he's basically not just been the Braves ace, he's been an ace in Major League Baseball to me since that 2020 season. And this year, he threw 174 innings, 29 starts, had a 3.25 ERA, went along with a 23% K rate, 8% walk rate, 59% ground ball rate, the highest of his career. That was the highest ERA, 3.25, that he has had since 2019, when he had a 4.02 ERA in 166 innings. That is how good he has been for the last 5-6 plus years. He has just been a dominant left-handed starter for Atlanta. He's got low walk rates, high ground ball rates. He gets righties out. He basically allows just no hard contact. I mean, you look at what he did last season. Average exit velocity against him was 86.3 miles an hour. That's in the 95th percentile. Barrel rate against him, 5%, 89th percentile. Hard hit rate, under 35%, in the 81st percentile. And then you add in a 59% ground ball rate. That's one of the highest of any starting pitcher in Major League Baseball. So even though he struggles against lefties more than righties, and lefties can hit the ball out at Camden Yards, he just puts the ball on the ground so often, it's not an issue. And it's this huge pitch mix, which flummoxes everyone. 7 pitches for Max Fried. 4-seamer, curveball, sinker, changeup, sweeper, slider, cutter. He throws them all at least 5% of the time. So it's not like there's one pitch he's just kind of toying with and barely throwing. No. Like everything is in his repertoire. His four-seamer, his curveball, his sinker, his changeup, all considered plus pitches by Baseball Savant. And the other three, sweeper, slider, cutter, just rate as average. He basically has no below average pitches, and he throws 7 of them. That is how good Max Fried is. If you can't get those absolutely tip-top guys, which Max Fried, I think, is one of them, he is at least projected to be a little bit cheaper. The John Becker free agent matrix projects him for a 6-year, $150 million contract this offseason. Now, that's a lot of money. 6 years, a lot of years for a starting pitcher. $150 million is a lot of money, right? We're looking at a guy who is trying to command $30 million a year as a starter. But when you look at the contracts that maybe a Blake Snell or Corbin Burns might be getting, Fried ends up a little bit more on the cheaper side for a guy who could be just as good as those two. Now, on the flip side, you're hearing all these green flags. The red flags are there for Max Fried, and it is with injury. He has not been the most durable starter. He's been pretty durable. 165 innings in 21, 185 in 22, 174 this year. That is solid. But he has had forearm issues each of the last 2 seasons. He only threw 78 innings and 14 starts in 2023. Now, he was great in those 14 starts, but he had a forearm issue that basically knocked him out for half the season. And then this year, he still made 29 starts. He was healthy for most of the year. But for a little part of August and September, he went on the injured list with another forearm issue. Now, he came back and he pitched in the regular season, and he pitched down the stretch as the Braves were able to get themselves somehow into the postseason. But you have back-to-back years with forearm issues. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but not generally, but a good chunk of Tommy John surgeries start with some forearm issues that then go to some elbow issues that then go to Tommy John. And the fact that it's been back-to-back years with forearm issues from Fried could tell you one of two things. One, it could say it's just really a forearm thing. It's not Tommy John, and it's something he might deal with again, but it's not going to get worse. Or B, it could tell you he might be on the brink of a major injury that keeps him out for a year. And if you're signing a guy for 6 years, losing 1 year is not the worst thing in the world. But you don't want it to happen right as you bring him in, and you are in your World Series window right here going into 2025. You're kind of continuing in that World Series window. That would keep me away a little bit. And I'll be honest with you, the forearm is the only reason why he was not considered or even put at number 1 on this list is because of that forearm. If he didn't have the forearm issues, I might be screaming for him over Corbin Burns and over the guy we're about to talk about as well. But when you have that injury issue, and every pitcher's got injury issues, right? Or things that could creep up. But specifically when you've had it each of the last 2 years, it does concern you a little bit. Now, Ken Rosenthal did report in The Athletic on Thursday that the Orioles are interested in Max Fried, second guy to report that this offseason. And Rosenthal also reported that Fried is currently on vacation, so he hasn't met with teams yet, and he will start meeting with teams when he does get back. But it'll be an interesting part of this Orioles free agent chase. But he's number 2 on the list because number 1 is Blake Snell. And why would it not be? Blake Snell, the 31-year-old, he's about to be 32 in December, left-hander who spent 2024 with the Giants, opted out of his deal with San Francisco to become a free agent once again for good reason. And the free agent matrix predicts him for a 4-year, $124 million deal. So it's not the long-term commitment that Fried could be. It's not the total commitment that Burns would be, but 4 years, $124 million. I mean, you're looking at $31 million a year for a guy that at times has had some durability issues like Fried has. But here's the thing. I still think overall for myself, if we're ranking all the starting pitchers, righties and lefties, Corbin Burns is still my number 1 target for the Orioles. And quite frankly, I think he's probably still long-term for your money and everything that comes with it, the best starting pitcher on the market. But you can make the argument for Blake Snell. And if they can't get Burns, they need to turn immediately to Blake Snell. And I know that if you've ever watched Blake Snell pitch, even though he has won not 1, but 2 Cy Young Awards, including in 2023, just last season. And he's one of the best pitchers in baseball. I know he can be tough to watch. He nibbles. He has long at-bats, high pitch counts. He walks guys. He doesn't get crazy deep into games. But the upside for Blake Snell is tremendous. 2 Cy Young Awards. And guess what? He threw 180 innings in 2023 when he won that Cy Young. And he did it also in 2018 when he won the first Cy Young. So he's able to throw a good chunk of innings if he stays healthy. Now, he did miss time this season, 2 different IL stints, but Neither was an arm issue, which is always a good thing. It was a groin strain and it was an adductor strain. But the moment he returned from that groin strain, he came back from that second injury off the injured list on July 9th. He, had that terrible offseason with Scott Boras where he was holding out for the big deal and he couldn't get it. And he signed like a weird 2-year deal with an opt-out in spring training with the Giants. His season got started late. He maybe got injured because of it. He went on the IL multiple times. It was just a disaster for the first half. But Snell returned from that second IL trip on July 9th. And he was, without a doubt, the best pitcher in the majors from that moment on for the remainder of the season. From July 9th to the end of the year, Blake Snell made 14 starts. He threw 80 1/3 innings. He had a let me set this again. He had a 1.23 ERA with a 1.77 FIP, a 38% strikeout rate to a 10% walk rate, and he allowed just 2 home runs in those 14 starts down the stretch. He threw a no-hitter in that stretch. He had a crazy dominant start in Baltimore against the Orioles in that stretch, and the stuff is just insane. It's insane. It's 96 from the left side. It's the best curveball probably in baseball. Opponents hit 111 against that thing and had a 50% swing and miss rate last year. It's a devastating changeup to righties. It's a slider that he doesn't throw much, only 10% of the time, but it can be unhittable. All 3 of his secondary pitches have whiff rates of 44% or more. He's got the best stuff plus of any pitcher who threw 100 innings in terms of his curveball. It's incredible stuff. And he's not going to stop walking people, right? Even when he got way better late in the season, his walk rate stayed the same. Like his walk rate for the entire year was 10.5%. Down the stretch, it was 10.1%. Like even when he got so much better, he's still going to walk guys. He's going to have walk rates. He won the Cy Young last year with a 13.3% walk rate. He won it in 2018 with a 9.1% walk rate. Like he's going to walk batters. He is, but he's going to miss an absurd amount of bats. This was his best season of his career, 34.7% strikeout rate. That was the highest rate of strikeouts Blake Snell has ever had. This is a guy who struck out a large percentage of batters. The stuff is amazing. The stretch he's been on when he's been healthy, all of 2023 and the second half of this year, he's been the best pitcher in baseball. If you chop out what happened early this year with the Giants, with the late signing and the injuries and all that bad stuff when he was pitching really poorly for a month or so, you take out that, Blake Snell's been the best pitcher in the major leagues for the last 2 years. You could argue it, but you look at the numbers, he has been the most dominant pitcher the last 2 years when he has been healthy. I want that on my team. Again, it's not the most fun watch at times when he's nibbling and struggling and walking guys, but when he is dialed in, it's not just unhittable. You can't make contact sometimes. And here's the most exciting part. This was kind of a roundabout report, but Ken Rosenthal, in that same story he wrote in The Athletic on Thursday, reported that the Orioles are interested in Blake Snell and said, quote, he was talking about how Blake Snell had met with the Red Sox and another team already. He said, quote, it is possible Snell also met or will meet with the Baltimore Orioles. Now, that's a very vague report, especially for Ken Rosenthal, who's the best in the game at this and reporting on this baseball stuff. So it's not really clear if he has already met with the O's, if he has plans to meet with the O's, or if Rosenthal is just saying it sounds like he's going to. But either way, the things are there. The O's are interested. They're going to meet with Blake Snell at some point this offseason. And when they do, listen, David Rubenstein is looking to win. He's looking to spend. They should be absolutely willing to offer Blake Snell 4 years, 120, 130 plus million. Just get him here on a shorter, higher average annual value deal and just say, come pitch and dominate for a team that needs you as their number one and can win the World Series next year. Blake Snell has done a lot of things. He has won 2 Cy Young Awards. He's been at times the best pitcher in baseball. But he's also played for the Rays and the Padres. He has not won a World Series. He has pitched in a World Series, and we know how that ended when Kevin Cash took him out a little early, but he has not won one. You can pitch him that you can win one here. You can be the ace of this staff. The ballpark plays to your strengths well. Come be our ace. We got a new rich owner who wants to spend his money. That should be the pitch to Snell. I know he's more of a West Coast guy. He's been on the West Coast recently. That's where he's from, but he's pitched in the AL East. He was with the Rays from 2016 to 2020. He knows these ballparks. He knows these offenses. Bring him to Baltimore. And again, Corbin Burns still my number one guy, but if you can't bring Burnsy back immediately to number 2, I want Blake Snell to stay in orange, but this time Oriole orange in 2025 and hopefully beyond. That'll do it for my free agent left-handed pitcher, starting pitcher wish list. Thank you so much for tuning into this one. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Subscribe to us wherever you listen as well. Leave a rating and a review if you can on Apple or Spotify. Really, really helps out the pod. Thanks for sticking with us. Closer to a 40-minute episode here on a Friday, but a lot of great pitchers to talk about. We'll continue in these Friday episodes to do these free agent wish lists. That'll do it for the week. We've got kind of an interesting deadline coming up today for the Orioles. It is the non-tender deadline to non-tender any of your arbitration-eligible players. I would think there's a good chance the Orioles will non-tender Emmanuel Rivera, and then there's maybe a couple guys they could. We'll see what they want to do. But whoever they do non-tender, or if they decide to tender a contract to everyone, that's fine too. We'll kind of explain the entire process and talk about what it means coming up on Monday's episode. We'll also chat about infielder Franklin Barreto, former top prospect who has, at least reportedly by his Mexican League team, signed a minor league deal with the Orioles. A couple of old friends like Austin Slater and Matt Crook have signed elsewhere. We'll get to it all when we are back on Monday's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.